right. Let's jump into this one this week. The ship we need to burn this week. The ship we need to burn this week is this idea of burning what we used to know. Burning what we used to know. The life that we think we know. This is how this works. Seth Godin, an author, not a Christian, but an author for leaders and business and things like that in the world right now, he says this: people never believe what you tell them. They rarely believe what you show them. They sometimes believe what their friends tell them. They always believe what they tell themselves. Which means the real value of leadership or coaching isn't necessarily providing information. It's helping people tell themselves different stories about themselves and what they're capable of. That person who believes they can't and the person who believes they can are both usually correct. The most important story, then, is the story you tell yourself. That's a weird kind of statement to start off this sermon with. And yet I want to draw some associations here because biblically it's a very rooted statement. Possibly the most significant and challenging thing about moving forward in faith with Jesus is the story that we tell ourselves about what is true about us and what is true about the world that surrounds us and the way that the world works. Maybe you walk in and say, it's going to be this way based on my experiences, based on the things that I've read or heard or were informed by my parents or things like this. A worldview that looks at life from a very specific angle. One of the most significant challenges in following Jesus is burning and leaving behind that perspective in life and adopting Jesus' perspective of life. Because Jesus' perspective is almost always wholeheartedly different than the one that I bring into the table. One of the more difficult challenges of people with PTSD, for instance, let's use that as an example, is learning that the fear response or trigger that they had back here that started something, this moment of emergency or panic or desperation or something that happened back here, this emotional reaction response, this thing, this feeling doesn't fit now. But I still keep on feeling like I need to react like I did back then in an emergency when it's not an emergency. Their story, the story that we have in our heads and our minds in this instance, our emotions, isn't helpful anymore. The story we tell ourselves frequently even ambushes us from becoming the people that the Father created us to be, that Jesus rescued us to be. Now the Israelites, as we look at the Bible, have a very similar problem. If you've read through any of the Old Testament, if you know the story of the Israelites in their journey, in being rescued and being God's people, they have a very similar problem. They repetitively struggled to move on from the story that they told themselves around cooking fires and community conversations. They were stuck in the past. They were stuck in moments back here, not in what God wanted to carry them forward into. They kept on going back and returning to the things that God said, I want you to be dead to that stuff. I don't want you to return to this stuff. I don't want you to go this direction. I want you to go this direction. Now, the Israelites ended up in Egypt in the story of Exodus and Genesis because of a famine, and God provided through one of their own, Joseph. We're going to look at Joseph next week, but God provided through one of their own, Joseph, who had become the second most powerful person in the nation of Egypt. Beyond Joseph's death, however, when the Israelites had a space in Egypt, the Egyptians, because they continued to keep on growing and growing and growing, they decided to enslave the people of Israel to to do the stuff that they wanted to do. Now, they did this for like 400 years. They were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, which is exactly when the Mayflower landed here in North America, if you think about it. It's a long time ago. Okay, let me retract that. That sounded weird. 400 years ago was when the Mayflower landed here in North America. That did not have any association with the Israelites in Egypt outside of the duration. So 400 years, the Egyptians have been enslaving the Israelites, and they have forgotten, the Israelites have forgotten what it's like to live free. Now we're talking about this long time of slavery, so this freedom, this idea has long been forgotten, and it wasn't like the Egyptians were benevolent slavers either. Exodus 1 captures it this way, verse 11. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless, Exodus says, in their demands. And I want you to remember this. I want you to remember this and hold on to this here in Exodus 1 because it's going to be really notable in a moment. Now, God cares about the Israelites who are enslaved, his people. He's made a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. Jacob is the father of Joseph. Joseph, now 400 years later, the Israelite people, God has said, you are my people. I am your God. I am going to care for you. And the Israelites could very much say, like, God, where are you? We've been enslaved for 400 years, generation after generation after generation. And now, 400 years later, God sends this dude named Moses, an Israelite himself who has been raised in the palace. And Moses returns to Egypt after being exiled for a while. He returns to Egypt, and miraculously, God works rescue for these people that he loves. And they're free. 400 years of slavery, the Israelites walk out of Egypt for free. They walk out of this nation that had been brutal and enslaving them and making their life so miserable. Out of Egypt they walk, and God miraculously keeps them free. Then the food began to run out. Exodus 16. The people, the Israelites, say this, Exodus 16, verse 3. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted, and now you've brought us out into this wilderness to starve us to death. Oh, if only we were back in Egypt where life was miserable and it stunk and I had to work so hard and it was painful and damaging. Oh, man, if only, because I had food back there. What is the story that the Israelites keep telling themselves? It was better when we had brutal slave drivers and life was bitter. It was better than it is right now where we're possibly running out of food. And in this moment where the Israelites are like, there's no food, God does another miracle like God does. And he provides manna for them to eat. Manna was this stuff that kind of appeared on the ground, and the Israelites would kind of scoop it up, and they'd make bread out of the daily provision that God would give. This ties back to what Becca was talking about here during communion. This daily opportunity, because the bread was not going to last till tomorrow. And the bread that Becca has in the country that she lives in doesn't last till tomorrow. God is providing for us right here, right now. Every day I am dependent on God to give me the food that I need so that I can survive. And so in communion, we recognize this. This ties together across all of the nations, and Becca's experience in Central Asia and our experience here now with Jesus. Jesus, I need you not just back then. I need you right now. Every day, I need your sacrifice for me. And this desperation, however, this repetitive nature of waking up and getting the manna and making it into bread and stuff like that becomes this moment of like, I don't want spaghetti for dinner anymore. I'm tired of having the same thing over and over and over again. There's only so many ways that you can make this manna taste a little different. I'm tired, so I'm starting to complain again. All I ever get is this manna. Numbers chapter 11 captures this complaint. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for free, and we had all the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic we wanted, but now our appetites were gone. All we ever see is this manna. Anybody identifying with their complaint if you put yourself in their shoes? So God does another miracle. He provides quail for the 1 million person nation every single night. So much that they just reached out and grabbed the quail. It wasn't called hunting, it was called grabbing. Then they get to the land that God promised them. And they send spies, 12 spies, into the area that God has promised them. And they all come back, and 10 of these spies come back saying, we will never make it. We can't defeat these people. They're too big, and we'll be slaughtered. And so the nation begins to complain yet again. Numbers 14. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died back in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Have you ever had one of these moments when you're talking with somebody where you're just like, it would be so much less painful for me to like knock my head repetitively against a brick wall? The Israelites aren't the only ones within Egypt that they have a gravitational pull to. We have our own Egypt. The life that we learned to live without Jesus, or before we met Jesus, continues to keep on having this magnetic attraction because so many people around us live this way. And even in the church, people live this way. We talked about kind of our flirtation with sin and why we need to burn the ship back to sin, because it's the old way of life, the way that we are rescued not to live anymore. And we have this gravitational pull to live the life that we used to know. Even if the life that I used to live, the life before Jesus rescued me, was broken, even if it was disturbing, even if it was dysfunctional, there's something comforting about returning to the past. We know how things worked back there, even if it was broken and dysfunctional. And maybe this morning, if we're being honest with each other, living the way that Jesus wants us to live, the way we've been rescued to live, the way that we see the Bible outlined for us so very clearly, we look at it and go, I don't understand how this works. I don't see how I can be like this. I don't see how I can do this. Mark Batterson, a pastor in Washington, D.C., and an author, he wrote this. He said, half of spiritual growth is learning what we don't know. The other half is unlearning what we do know. Isn't that the challenge, isn't it? Unlearning what I do know. To live the life that Jesus rescued us to live to go to the places that he is calling us to go to, we need to burn the ships back to what we used to know. Maybe we think we know so much better, or we're educated, or we're knowledgeable, or I have some confidence about this thing back here. The dysfunctional, selfishly obsessed life that caused so much chaos for us and damage for us in the first place, we need to just cut ties and say, we're not doing this anymore. I'm not going back there. I'm not going to entertain this stuff. I'm not going to return back to my old Egypt. Like I said, the further draw is that many of us pursue comfort in our life, and there is some sort of comfort knowing and returning back to something that's dysfunctional, even if it's not positive. It's really uncomfortable when we don't know what to do, when we don't know how to respond, when we don't know what is next. I really like periods at the end of my sentences rather than question marks. I want certainties rather than uncertainties. When we begin to follow Jesus, the life that he's inviting us into could not be more foreign. It could not be more different than going to Central Asia and living a life in a country that is much different than the one you or I grew up in, perhaps. When I was much younger and my kids were much younger, for a few months we spent time at Eden House in Thailand, North Thailand, up near Laos and the Burma border. One of the missionary groups that we support here at North Lake. They rescue girls out of human trafficking situations in northern Thailand. And Thai culture, as I was there, was so different from Western culture that I had grown up with that it became a foregone conclusion in my head as we were there for a few months, that it became a foregone conclusion that if it didn't make sense, then it was just how Chiang Rai culture worked. It's just how it worked. Just, didn't make sense. Well, that's Thai culture for you. So much so was this confusion or understandableness of that culture, so much so that I unknowingly took one of these girls that lived at the home, and I dropped her off in a neighboring country, effectively making me a human trafficker, which was precisely, like I said, what Eden House came to take away. I found out that I was in this other country by accident, and I was like, I might die. I'm going to die in a Burmese prison. My kids back in Chiang Rai, my wife will never know what happened to me. I'm just going to disappear. It's going to be terrible. Now, I fixed the mistake that I made, but the same level of confusion that I was living with in Thailand is often the same interaction we have with the way of Jesus. It doesn't make any sense. What do you mean you're not focused on getting stuff or advancement or holding on to resentment or living life in a different way or being generous and kind? I don't get it. How can you be loving when somebody's like that? How can you be loving when they make me want to beat my head against the brick wall? It doesn't make sense based on how I've lived my life for so very long. It doesn't seem to acknowledge the reality of the world I live in and the way that others around me live. The way of Jesus is to turn the whole of life upside down from what we were confident that we knew. If you are questioning what I'm trying to say, I will just encourage you to read 3 chapters of the Bible and not let it mess with you. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I dare you. I really do. This is why in discipleship we need someone who has walked the way of Jesus ahead of us, in advance of us, someone who has walked the way of Jesus, to share their life with us, to share what is true with us, to share new habits with us, because we need to learn to live upside down to the life we've been living. Remember the Godin quote way back at the very, very beginning of today? The real value of leadership or coaching isn't necessarily providing information. It's helping people tell different stories about themselves, even what they're capable of. To follow Jesus means to burn the ships back to the past and when life was known and maybe even comfortable. Burning the ships back to what we once knew opens us up to live obediently into the future that God is creating for you and for me. Because I'm not trying to shove God into my past. I'm trying to live into the future God has opened up for me. We have to unlearn what we learned when we were apart from Jesus. The life that follows Jesus is built on a completely different foundation. Psalm 40, David says this. He says, I waited patiently for the Lord to help me, and he turned to me and he heard my cry. He lifted me out of the pit of despair, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. He's given me a new song to sing, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see what he has done and be amazed. They will put their trust in the Lord. God has given me a new song to sing. There's a behavior, there's a pattern, there's a habit that I have learned in my life. I've shared it here from the stage a few different times, that when I have these invasive thoughts that are like causing me to go like, I'm taking it. It's like, I got to go back and return to what I know, where it's comfortable, where it's safe, whatever. I sit down and I meditate on what God has told me is true. My office is on this side of the building, and it stares out at the woods, which is quite awesome. And so, unless people are peeing in it, and that's really not awesome, there's many, many different things that happen on this side of the building that we won't talk about, that we've had to say, hey, don't do that. But sitting there and looking out into the woods and repeating to myself what is true rather than what I'm afraid of is a new song to sing. It's a new song that God has given me to sing, to say, it's not like you used to have it. Burn the ship back to here, Steve. Live forward into what God has said is true, and here's what's true. Steve, you're loved, you're cared for. I love you, you're valuable to me. I accept you. You're worth it for me. He has given me a new song to sing, David says. A hymn of praise to our God. God has a new song for you to sing. Not the song that was built on pursuing sin, not the song that was built on pursuing selfishness and what you wanted and what you thought you needed, or what you demanded for yourself because we were told to emphasize and elevate ourselves. Instead, he has a new song, a better song, a more beautiful song. If only we would burn the ships back to our Egypt. If only we'd burn the ships back to our Egypt, the things that we used to know. The invitation today that I'd like to provide and invite you into is to stop and think about this. What is my Egypt? What's the life that I've kept ties back to, that Jesus rescued me from, but I've kept a line open to because it made sense? or because that's how everybody else said the world worked, and so I just believed them. Are there any little kids in the room today? Have we ever talked about Santa, right? Now, I believed that Santa was there because my mom and dad said so, and now I don't know what to believe anymore because mom and dad are liars. Maybe let's make it not Santa and make it about something else. This is the way the world works, son. This is the way the world works, daughter. What's that thing that you've become convinced is the way that things are? That isn't benefiting you. It's not working. In fact, it's causing you stress. It's causing you anxiety. It's causing you worry. Sleepless days or sleepless nights. You shouldn't be asleep during the day, I guess. Whatever. I find naps amazing and delightful, but whatever. What is God wanting us to burn the ship back to? The thing that was miserable, kept us in bondage, and He's freed us from. Amanda, do we have a response song? Why don't we do that? For Jesus, we come to you today. People who complain a lot, just like the Israelites. Wanting maybe the benefits of life back there, whatever that was, whatever that looked like, and completely unsure about what to do about this new life, the life you've rescued us for. Questions and question marks, Lord Jesus, can be really discouraging and can get us to be afraid and not move forward. And we'll want to go back to something that we used to know. Lord, I see it in my own life. I see it in the life of those who call North Lake home. Pray, Lord, that you would help us to burn these ships. It's hard moving beyond the past and the ties that they have to us. But Lord, I pray that right now, you get out a little bit of arsonist in us. We'd start seeing what you have for us, the truth that you have to say to us about the life that you want us to live. I pray you would give us courage to burn the ties back to the past so that we can live the new life you've rescued us for. Transform us and change us like Romans 12 says. Give us the truth so we can think differently. And as we are thinking differently and believing differently because of what you say, that our lives will be transformed and begin to mirror and model a life that we didn't think was possible, but a life that is so much better. Help us to overcome our fears, our anxieties, and our worries even now, to live forward, to pursue you with all of our hearts. In your name we pray. Amen.